The dust of dead mule was a flavor. It was a fine red powder that settled on the back of the tongue, a constant gritty reminder that you were in a place the world had not quite finished making. On a Saturday, the taste grew stronger. The main street, a wide gash of churned earth, filled with miners, ranchers, and families from homesteads miles away. Their wagons and horses kicked up the territory's soil until the air itself seemed to bleed. Abigail Whitfield felt the grit in her teeth as she propped open the door to Tante May's boarding house and saloon. The morning air, still holding a hint of night's chill, did little to cut through the smells of bacon fat, stale beer, and horse sweat that defined market day. She was 21, the daughter of the town's late blacksmith, and carried herself with a quiet efficiency that people often mistook for meekness. Her hands, however, were her father's hands, capable and sure as she wiped down the long pine bar. Tante May, a woman whose French Creole origins were evident in the spice she added to her stew and the fire in her dark eyes, nodded in approval. She was a fortress in calico, her presence the only law that truly mattered within these four walls. The bat-wing doors swung open, casting a long, sharp shadow that silenced the morning's low chatter. Silas Boone stood framed in the doorway, a man whose wealth was so new it still looked uncomfortable on him. His suit was black wool, too heavy for the season, and his boots were polished to a gleam that was an insult to the town's pervasive dust. He owned the most profitable gold claim in the Black Hills, and he moved as if he had a deed to the air everyone else breathed. His eyes, small and pale, found Abigail immediately. He took off his hat, revealing hair slicked down with pomade. The smile he offered was a calculated arrangement of his features, containing no warmth at all. He strode to the bar, his spurs making a sound like tiny, angry bells. The other patrons, a collection of grizzled prospectors and weary farmers, found reasons to be intensely interested in their coffee cups. "Mr. Boone, what can I get for you this morning?" Abigail kept her voice even, her eyes on the whiskey bottle she was wiping. He did not want to drink. He wanted to look at her, his gaze a heavy thing, like a hand on her shoulder. He leaned in, his voice a low rumble meant only for her. "I find myself thinking of the future, Miss Whitfield. A town like this needs families. A man like me needs a wife to build a respectable home." Abigail's grip tightened on the bottle. She could feel Tante May's attention from across the room, as sharp as a needle. She wished her father were still alive. His broad shoulders and the smell of the forge, a shield she had always taken for granted. "This is a boarding house, Mr. Boone, not a matchmaker's office." His smile tightened. A fine wit, a desirable quality. "We will speak more on this later." He turned and walked out, leaving a silence that felt heavier than the noise before he had entered. Tante May came to her side, her face a thundercloud. "That man," she murmured, "is a sickness. You stay clear of him. You hear me, Cherie?" Abigail nodded, the knot in her stomach a cold, hard thing. An hour later, a commotion drew her to the porch. A small crowd had gathered around the water trough, their voices a low, ugly murmur. In the center, a Lakota woman was trying to soothe her child, a little boy of about 5 who had sagged against the dusty planks. His face flushed and his breathing shallow. The sun was climbing, beating down with a merciless intensity. "He is sick. Get him away from the town water," a man snarled. "They carry diseases," another added. Abigail saw only a child in distress and a mother's frantic eyes. She pushed through the ring of onlookers, ignoring their glares. She dipped a clean rag from her apron pocket into the trough, wrung it out, and gently knelt by the boy. She placed the cool, damp cloth on his forehead. His skin was fire-hot. "Let me help," she said softly to the mother. "Inside, out of the sun." The woman looked at her, her face a mask of weary distrust. But she saw the simple kindness in Abigail's eyes and gave a slow, hesitant nod. Abigail helped her lift the boy, who was limp as a rag doll. and guided them toward the inn's shaded porch. Just as she was settling them onto a bench in the shade, a man appeared at the edge of the porch. He moved with a quietness that was startling in the boisterous town. He was Lakota, tall and lean, his face all angles and planes, his eyes dark and watchful. He wore buckskin trousers and a simple cotton shirt, and his long black hair was tied back with a leather cord. There was a stillness about him that seemed to absorb the town's noise. He looked at the boy, then at the cool cloth on his forehead, and then his gaze met Abigail's. The Lakota woman spoke to him in their tongue, her voice low and rapid. He listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he looked back at Abigail. His English was clear, with only a slight accent, the words chosen with care. "The sun is strong. You are kind." He did not smile, but the words were a form of currency more valuable than Boone's false compliments. He knelt and spoke to the boy, his voice a gentle murmur. After a moment, he lifted the child into his arms with an easy strength and nodded once more to Abigail. Then he and the woman were gone, melting back into the bustle of the street, leaving Abigail with a strange feeling that she had just witnessed something significant, a quiet moment of grace in a graceless place. The afternoon descended like a hammer. Silas Boone returned, and this time he was not alone. He was flanked by Marshal Harlan Pike, a man whose face was a permanent scowl and whose silver star was tarnished with more than just dust. They cornered her by the front desk, trapping her between the counter and the narrow staircase. Tanta May moved to intervene, but Marshal Pike held up a hand, a gesture of authority that was both lazy and absolute. "Miss Whitfield," Boone began, his voice slick with false sympathy, "a certain financial matter has come to my attention. It seems your father, may he rest in peace, left behind a considerable debt to me." He produced a piece of paper from his coat pocket and slid it across the counter. It was a promissory note for an amount so large it made Abigail's head spin. And at the bottom was a signature, a crude, clumsy imitation of her father's elegant script. "This is a forgery. My father was a meticulous man. He owed no one." Marshal Pike cleared his throat. "I have reviewed the document. The signature appears valid. It is certified. The debt is legal." Tanta May snatched the paper. "This is trash. Samuel Whitfield was an honest man. This is a lie. And you, Harlan Pike, are a disgrace to that star." The marshal's face darkened, but Boone simply smiled, a predator who knew the trap was set. "Of course," he said, his eyes locking onto Abigail's. "There is no need for unpleasantness, no need to seize this fine establishment or your personal effects. A debt can be settled in other ways. An alliance, a union between our families, would more than satisfy the account." The implication was as stark and ugly as a gallows. "Marry me," he was saying, "or I will take everything." Abigail felt the blood drain from her face. She looked from Boone's triumphant smirk to Pike's indifferent stare. The law was not on her side. The law was standing right in front of her, for sale to the highest bidder. She had never felt so utterly alone. Later that evening, the weight of the day pressing down on her, Abigail sought refuge in the cool, dark storeroom at the back of the inn. She was stacking canvas sacks of flour, the repetitive motion a small comfort, when she heard voices from the alley just outside the thin plank wall. Boone and Pike. Their words were low, but the wood was thin, and their meaning was brutally clear. She pressed her ear to a crack in the wall, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "The girl is more stubborn than I expected," Boone was saying, a note of irritation in his voice. "She will come around," Pike replied, his tone bored. "She has no choice. Once the papers are signed and you are her husband, it is all perfectly legal. It is not the girl I am worried about. It is the land her father left her, that little plot up by Blue Notch." Abigail froze. Her father's plot. It was a small piece of land, mostly rock and scrub, but it had a spring, the Blue Notch Spring, a steady, year-round source of clear, cold water. In this dry territory, water was more precious than gold. With the railroad looking to lay a new spur line through these hills, Pike continued, the man who controls that spring controls everything downstream. The price of that land will be staggering. Marrying the girl is the cleanest way to get your hands on it without a fight. So the debt, the marriage, it was all a lie. It was never about her. She was just a key, a tool to be used to steal her own inheritance. A cold fury, sharp and clean. Cut through her fear, they saw her as a pawn, a thing to be moved around a board of their own making. The conversation in the alley ended. Footsteps receded. Abigail sank down onto a flour sack. The dust puffing up around her. The world had tilted on its axis. She was no longer just a blacksmith's daughter trying to make her way. She was an obstacle. And in the Dakota territory, obstacles were removed, one way or another. That night, long after the last drunk had been poured out into the street and the lamps were turned down low, Tanta May found her sitting in the darkened kitchen. The older woman did not say anything for a long moment. She simply sat down across from Abigail at the heavy wooden table and placed two items on the worn surface. The first was a small leather pouch, heavy with the clink of coins. The second was a tiny pistol, a pearl-handled derringer, small enough to fit in the palm of her hand. It looked like a toy, but Abigail knew it was not. "He will not stop," Tanta May said, her voice a low, fierce whisper. "Men like Boone do not take no for an answer. They take what they want, and the law here is whatever he pays it to be." Abigail stared at the gun. She had never held one in her life. The very idea of it made her hands tremble. "I cannot," she whispered. "I do not know how." Tanta May's hand covered hers, her grip surprisingly strong. You learn or you let him win. There is no other choice for a woman alone out here. This is not a world for doves. Cherie, you must be a hawk." She pushed the coin purse toward Abigail. "It is not much, but it is enough to get you started. There is a horse in the stable, the bay mare. She is fast and she is steady. Ride north, toward the Cheyenne River. Do not follow the main road. Stay in the hills. Put as much distance between you and this place as you can before sunup." "But where will I go?" "Anywhere but here." Tears welled in Abigail's eyes, hot and stinging. She was leaving the only home she had ever known, her father's forge, the familiar comfort of this kitchen. Tanta May pulled her into a fierce embrace. "You are your father's daughter. You have iron in your spine. Now go. Do not look back." Abigail nodded, her throat too tight for words. She tucked the purse deep into her dress pocket and picked up the derringer. It was cold and heavy, a terrible and necessary weight. In the quiet of the stable, the smell of hay and horse a comforting balm. She saddled the bay mare. Her movements were clumsy in the dark, but her resolve was a hard, bright flame. She led the horse out into the back alley and swung herself into the saddle. She took one last look at the sleeping town of Dead Mule, a place of red dust and stolen justice. Then she turned the horse north and nudged her into a trot. The quiet clip of hooves on the dirt road the only sound in the vast, dark silence of the prairie. She was running, not just from Silas Boone, but toward a future she could not yet imagine, with nothing but a handful of coins, a horse, and a terrifying piece of steel to see her through. The night was a vast, star-dusted ocean, and Abigail was a tiny boat adrift upon it. The flat prairie gave way to a broken land of deep ravines and towering sandstone sentinels that clawed at the moon. The bay mare, true to Tanta May's word, was steady, her hooves picking a sure-footed path through the treacherous terrain, but Abigail's courage, so bright and hard when she fled, was beginning to fray. Every shadow was a rider, every coyote's howl the sound of pursuit. She was following the spine of a long, rocky canyon, the walls rising up on either side like a formidable fortress. It offered concealment, but it also felt like a trap. The air grew still, heavy and charged with an unseen energy. A low moan began in the distance, a sound that was not animal or human. It was the sound of the land itself gathering its breath. The wind hit first, a sudden, violent gust that tore at her hair and stung her eyes with sand. Within minutes, the stars were gone, blotted out by a churning wall of red dust. The world shrank to the space immediately around her and the horse. The air turned thick and suffocating, the fine grit coating her throat and making it impossible to breathe without coughing. The mare whinnied, a high, nervous sound, and began to dance sideways, her eyes wide with terror. Abigail fought to control the panicked animal, her own fear a cold knot in her stomach. She could see nothing, could hear nothing but the screaming of the wind. She was blind, lost in a swirling vortex of earth and air. And then she heard it, a sound that sliced through the storm's roar, a low, guttural growl, answered by another, and then a chorus of yips and howls that seemed to come from all directions at once. Through the haze of dust, she saw shapes, lean and low to the ground, circling her. Their eyes were faint yellow gleams in the maelstrom. Wolves. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. Her hand fumbled in her pocket for the derringer. The small pistol felt clumsy and alien in her trembling fingers. She pulled it out, trying to remember what little she knew of firearms. Point and pull. She aimed at the nearest pair of glowing eyes, squeezed her own eyes shut, and pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening, a sharp crack that was instantly swallowed by the wind. The recoil jolted her arm, and the mare, already terrified, reared violently. Abigail lost her grip on the reins and her seat in the saddle. She tumbled to the hard, rocky ground, her head striking a stone with a sickening thud. Pain, white-hot and blinding, shot up from her ankle. She lay there, dazed, the world a spinning, dusty nightmare. The wolves were closing in, their forms clearer now, emboldened by her fall. She tried to push herself up, but her ankle buckled, sending another wave of agony through her. This is it, she thought, a strange, detached calm settling over her. This is how it ends. A sudden flare of light cut through the gloom. A torch, its flames whipping wildly in the wind, held aloft by a figure that seemed to emerge from the rock itself. A man's voice shouted something, a sharp, commanding cry in a language she did not understand. A high, piercing whistle followed, a sound that seemed to cut right through the wolves' nerves. They faltered, their low growls turning to whimpers. The torch swung in a wide arc, and the pack broke, melting back into the red dust as silently as they had appeared. The man knelt beside her. Through the swirling dust and the fog of pain, she recognized him. It was the Lakota man from the town market, the one who had thanked her for helping the child. He spoke, his voice calm and steady amidst the storm. "You are hurt." Abigail pushed herself up on her elbows, her mind racing. He could not know who she was. He could not take her back. She clutched the empty derringer, a useless piece of metal now. "I am fine," she lied, her voice raspy. He looked at her twisted ankle, then back at her face. His expression was patient, as if he were dealing with a frightened child. "The wind is a liar, and so are you. You cannot walk on that." "His camp is near," he said, already moving to retrieve her horse, which stood trembling a few yards away. "You can rest there." "No, I have to keep going." Her voice sounded thin and desperate, even to her own ears. He led the horse back and stood looking down at her, the torchlight casting deep shadows across the angles of his face. Going where? Into the storm. To feed the wolves. It is not a good plan. He reached down to help her, but she flinched away. "Who are you?" "My name is Chaska." She stared at him, suspicion warring with the undeniable fact that he had just saved her life. This was the wild country. She had heard stories of renegades, of men who lived outside the law. "Are you an outlaw?" For the first time, the corner of his mouth twitched, a fleeting hint of a smile. If I were, I would have taken your horse first, and I would not be wasting a good torch. Now, are you going to let me help you, or do you prefer to stay here and talk with the rocks?" The pain in her ankle was a fierce, throbbing thing, and the dust was making it hard to think. She had no other choice. She gave a stiff, reluctant nod. He helped her to her feet, his grip on her arm strong and sure. She had to lean on him heavily, a humiliating necessity that chafed at her pride. With a surprising gentleness, he lifted her onto the mare's back, then took the reins and began to lead the horse forward into the fading storm. They walked for what felt like an eternity, though it was likely only a short distance. The wind began to subside, and the dust settled, revealing a sky washed clean and littered with brilliant stars. The air smelled of rain, a clean, earthy scent that promised life. Chaska led her to a small encampment tucked into a sheltered cove, invisible from the main canyon. A small fire crackled, and a simple lean-to made of branches and hides stood against the rock wall. An old man sat by the fire, his face a beautiful web of wrinkles, his eyes deep and serene. Chaska spoke to him in their language, and the old man's gaze turned to Abigail. He looked at her not with curiosity, but with a calm, knowing acceptance. He rose slowly and came toward her. "This is Two Moons," Chaska said. "He knows how to mend things." Two Moons examined her ankle with hands that were surprisingly gentle. He nodded to himself, then went to a leather pouch and took out a handful of leaves, which he crushed between two stones, mixing them with a little water to make a green paste. He spread the poultice over her swollen ankle, the effect instantly cool and soothing. As he worked, he spoke, his voice like the rustle of dry leaves. Chaska translated. "He says the spirit of the horse is strong, but the rider must learn its language. He says the gun is a loud voice that says little. It is better to have a quiet voice that speaks the truth." Two Moons wrapped her ankle with a clean strip of cloth. He looked from her to Chaska and said something else, his tone soft but firm. "He reminds me that a guest is a gift, but a gift must be given freely." Chaska translated, his eyes meeting Abigail's. "You are safe here. No one will harm you. You may stay until the ankle is strong, and then you may go where you choose." Abigail murmured her thanks, feeling a wave of exhaustion wash over her. She allowed Chaska to help her to a bed of soft furs in the lean-to. She was a fugitive, injured and alone, in a camp of strangers who were supposed to be her enemies, yet she had not felt this safe since her father died. The next day, as she rested her foot by the fire, a rider came into the camp, a young Lakota man who spoke with urgency to Chaska and Two Moons. Abigail could not understand their words, but she heard a phrase that was achingly familiar: "Blue Notch." When the rider had gone, the air in the camp was different, heavier. Chaska came and sat near her, staring into the flames. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "What is Blue Notch?" He turned to look at her, his dark eyes searching her face. "It is a place of water, a spring. It is important to my people, and to the ranchers, and now, to the Iron Horse." "The railroad." He nodded. "Men have come to survey the land. They say a new track will be built through the hills. It will need much water. The man who holds the spring at Blue Notch will hold the future of this land in his hand." Abigail's blood ran cold. It all clicked into place. Silas Boone did not just want the land for its potential value. He wanted it to sell to the railroad. He wanted to hold the entire territory hostage. And she was the key. His greed was larger and more dangerous than she had ever imagined. She looked out from the shelter of the cove, at the vast, beautiful, and brutal landscape. The sky was a brilliant blue, and the air was still, pregnant with the smell of rain that had fallen in the night. It was a land of stark contrasts, of sudden storms and profound peace. She had fled into the wilderness to escape one man's tyranny, only to find herself at the center of a much larger conflict, a battle for the very lifeblood of the land itself, and her enemies were more powerful than ever. The days that followed settled into a new rhythm, dictated by the sun and the slow healing of Abigail's ankle. Survival, she quickly learned, was not a single desperate act of running, but a series of quiet, deliberate lessons. Chaska became her teacher, his methods as patient and unyielding as the landscape itself. The first lesson was fire. He did not simply show her how to strike a spark to tinder. He taught her to read the wood, to know the difference between the fast, hot burn of pine and the slow, steady heat of oak. He showed her how to build a fire that would give warmth, but not a column of smoke that could be seen for miles, digging a small pit and banking it with stones to reflect the heat inward. She learned that a fire was not just a tool, but a responsibility. The second lesson was water. He taught her how to find it, following the lines of cottonwood trees that signaled a hidden stream, and how to preserve it, sipping slowly rather than gulping it down. He showed her how to tie the knot for a water skin so it would not leak a single precious drop. In this land, water was life, and to waste it was a sin more profound than any she had heard preached from a pulpit. He taught her the language of the earth, the subtle stories told in a broken twig or an overturned stone. She learned to distinguish the track of a deer from that of a wolf, to see the passage of a rider in the bruised blades of grass. Her world, which had once been a terrifying and empty expanse, began to fill with meaning and information. With a knife, he taught her not to fight, but to live. He showed her how to skin a rabbit with clean, efficient strokes, how to strip sinew for cord, and how to carve a peg for a loose saddle strap. Her father's hands, accustomed to the heavy hammer, learned a new and delicate strength. She was a quick study, her mind sharp and eager to absorb the practical knowledge that was keeping her alive. But the gun remained a barrier. Chaska brought out the small derringer one morning, along with a larger, more formidable revolver he carried. He had reloaded her pistol, and he set a piece of bark on a distant rock. "You must know how to use this," he said, his voice neutral. "To be without a voice in this land is to be a ghost. This is a loud voice." Abigail took the derringer, its weight still a cold shock in her palm. Her hand trembled, not from fear of the noise, but from the terrible purpose of the object. The thought of pointing it at another living thing, of pulling the trigger and ending a life, made her feel sick. She raised it, but her arm shook so badly she could not aim. "I cannot," she whispered, lowering it. "What if I hurt someone by mistake? What if I have to hurt someone on purpose?" Chaska was silent for a long moment. He looked at the gun in her hand, then at her face. "Survival is the first victory," he said softly. "Taking a life is the last resort. It is a heavy stone to carry, but sometimes you must pick it up to keep a heavier one from crushing you." He gestured for her to raise the gun again. "Do not think of it as a strike, like a hammer. Do not pull the trigger. Breathe. Let the air out slow. Now, squeeze the trigger as if you are slowly pressing a door closed. Let the gun be surprised by the noise." She tried again, the simple instruction calming the frantic beating of her heart. She took a breath, let it out, and focused on the slow, steady pressure of her finger. The gun still wavered. She could not bring herself to complete the action. She lowered it, defeated. Chaska did not push her. He simply nodded, taking the gun and putting it away. The lesson was over, but the question remained, hanging in the quiet air between them. A few days later, a new scent drifted on the wind, sharp and acrid. Smoke. Chaska was on his feet in an instant, his eyes scanning the horizon to the south. A faint orange haze stained the clear blue sky. "Grass fire," he said, his voice tight. "And the wind is pushing it this way." He was already moving, grabbing ropes and a water skin. He looked at Abigail's ankle, which was now strong enough for her to walk on with only a slight limp. "You can ride." They saddled their horses in a practiced silence. The smell of smoke grew stronger, and soon they could see the fire itself, a hungry orange line consuming the dry prairie grass, moving with a terrifying speed. As they crested a small rise, they saw a small homestead directly in its path, a modest cabin and a set of corrals. A small herd of cattle was milling nervously, their lowing a sound of pure panic. A man and a woman were frantically trying to drive the herd toward a shallow creek bed. The man, Abigail saw, was Miguel Delgado, a rancher who sometimes came to Dead Mule for supplies. His wife, Rosa, rode with a skill that was breathtaking, herding the terrified animals with shouts and the skilled movements of her horse. "They are friends," Chaska said. "We will help them." They rode down into the chaos. The heat of the approaching fire was a physical presence, a blast of hot air that seared the lungs. The roar was a constant, growing thunder. Miguel saw them and waved, his face streaked with soot and sweat. "The fire is too fast. We cannot outrun it." "We do not run," Chaska shouted over the noise. "We make a stand, the creek bed. We can widen it. Make a break, the fire cannot jump." There was no time to argue. They dismounted, grabbing shovels and heavy blankets from the Delgado's wagon, working with a desperate, frantic energy. They began to scrape away the grass and brush on the far side of the creek, creating a wide band of bare earth. Abigail's hands, soft from her work at the inn, were raw and blistered within minutes. But she did not stop. The fear of the fire was greater than the pain. She worked alongside Rosa, the two of them falling into a rhythm, their shared purpose a bond stronger than any words. The fire was upon them, a 50-foot wall of flame and black smoke. The heat was unbearable, the noise a deafening roar that vibrated through the soles of their boots. The cattle screamed. Abigail squeezed her eyes shut, certain they were about to be consumed. Then, with a great whoosh, the fire hit the creek bed and the fire break they had carved. For a heart-stopping moment, it seemed to leap, embers flying across the bare earth like angry red insects. But the break held. The main body of the fire swept past them, continuing its destructive march northward, leaving behind a smoldering, blackened landscape and the incredible gift of their lives. They stood in the warm ash, coughing in the thick smoke, their faces black, their bodies trembling with exhaustion and relief. Miguel clasped Chaska's shoulder, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved us. You saved everything." Rosa gave Abigail a tired, grateful smile. "We owe you our lives." That evening, as they shared a simple meal of beans and tortillas at the Delgados' smoke-scented table, another rider approached. This one was not Lakota or Mexican. It was a woman, riding astride like a man, her face smudged with dirt and her eyes bright with an intelligent curiosity. She carried a reporter's notebook and a pencil. "My name is Edie Quinn," she announced, dismounting with a weary grace. "I write for the Dakota Pioneer. I saw the smoke from the stage road and came to get the story." Miguel recounted the day's events, praising Chaska and Abigail for their help. Edie Quinn's pencil flew across the page, but her eyes kept drifting to Abigail. "And you, miss, what is your name?" Abigail hesitated. The less attention she drew to herself, the better. "Anne," she said, the first name that came to mind. "Anne Smith." Edie Quinn smiled, a small, knowing smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "Anne Smith. I see, a brave woman. I heard a rumor in Dead Mule about a brave young woman who had a disagreement with Silas Boone." She was said to have left town rather suddenly. Abigail's heart gave a lurch. She kept her face impassive. "I do not know anyone by that name. We were just passing through and saw people in trouble." "Of course," Edie said, her tone light, but her gaze was sharp. She closed her notebook. "Well, it is a fine story of neighbor helping neighbor. The kind people like to read." She thanked the Delgados for their time, mounted her horse, and rode off, leaving Abigail with the unsettling feeling that she had not been fooled in the slightest. The world was shrinking again. That night, back at Chaska's camp, the air was cool and smelled of burned earth and the promise of rain. The stars were brilliant in the blackened sky. Abigail sat by the fire, her hands aching, her mind replaying the day's terror and triumph. Chaska sat across from her, polishing the blade of his knife with a piece of leather. For a long time. He was silent. Then he began to speak, his voice low, as if he were talking more to the fire than to her. "My grandfather's grandfather," he said, "believed these hills, the Paha Sapa, were the center of the world. He said they were the backbone of a great beast, and that all life flowed from them. The rock is the bone, the trees are the hair, and the water from the springs is the blood." He looked up, and his eyes met hers across the dancing flames. When the gold was found, the men who came to dig did not see the bone or the blood. They only saw the glitter. They broke the bone to get the glitter, and they did not care if the beast bled to death. He looked out into the vast darkness that surrounded their small circle of light. To live here is not just to be on the land. It is to be part of it. The fire comes, and it burns. It seems like an ending. But the ash feeds the soil. The rain comes, and new grass grows, greener than before. It is a circle. Abigail listened, understanding that he was giving her a gift, a piece of his own truth. He was telling her about his home, his people, his soul. She looked at her own hands, blistered and stained with soot. She had fought a fire and won. She had stood with strangers and made them friends. She was no longer just Abigail Whitfield, the blacksmith's daughter. She was a woman who had survived, who had helped, who was learning a new language in a new world. The fear was still there, a cold stone in her belly, but for the first time, she felt the faint, unfamiliar stirring of hope, like the new grass after a fire. It was a fragile thing, but it was alive. The fragile peace born from the ashes of the grass fire lasted 3 days. It was a time of shared labor and quiet gratitude. Abigail, Chaska, and 2 moons had stayed at the Delgado homestead, helping Miguel and Rosa repair a section of burned corral fence. The work was hard, the sun relentless, but in the evenings, they would gather on the porch, sharing stories as the sky bled from orange to purple. For the first time since she fled Dead Mule, Abigail felt the ghost of a normal life, a sense of belonging that was as nourishing as the food Rosa set before them. A supply wagon from town, making a wide circuit, had stopped at the ranch the previous afternoon. The driver had a small, cloth-wrapped package for Miguel, and tucked inside was a letter addressed in Tanta May's elegant script to a Miss Ann Smith. Abigail's hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was the promissory note Boone had used to threaten her, and a short, defiant message. Proof of the devil's lies. Use it well. Be a hawk. Cherie. Abigail had folded the papers carefully and tucked them into the lining of her skirt, the crisp edges a secret weapon against her heart. The peace was shattered on the morning of the 4th day by the rhythmic beat of shod hooves. A group of riders crested the rise overlooking the homestead, their dark shapes stark against the bright morning sky. Marshal Harlan Pike was in the lead, his tarnished star glinting. Beside him, impossibly neat in his black wool suit, rode Silas Boone. They had 4 other men with them, hard-faced and carrying rifles. Miguel Delgado stepped onto the porch, his body placing him between his home and the approaching riders. Rosa appeared in the doorway behind him, her face a grim mask. Chaska, who had been watering the horses, straightened up slowly, his movements calm and deliberate, his hand resting nowhere near the revolver at his hip. He simply watched, his stillness a stark contrast to the aggressive energy of the posse. "Marshal Pike, a word," Miguel called out, his voice steady. "This is private land." Pike reined in his horse a few yards from the porch, the animal snorting and stamping in the dust. "I am here on official business. Delgado, we are looking for a runaway, a young woman, goes by the name of Abigail Whitfield. indentured to Mr. Boone here to pay off a family debt. Boone's pale eyes scanned the homestead, and a slow, triumphant smile spread across his face as he saw Abigail, who had frozen near the water pump. He had found her. "There is no one here by that name," Miguel said, his voice hard as granite. Pike's gaze was flat and cold. "Now, do not make this difficult. Harboring a fugitive is a serious offense. We have a witness who saw her heading in this direction in the company of an Indian." He gestured behind him, and one of the other riders, a scrawny miner Abigail recognized from the saloon, nudged his horse forward. "That is her," he whined, pointing a grimy finger. "And that is the Lakota she was with." Abigail felt a cold dread wash over her, but it was followed by a hot surge of anger. They would not do this. They would not hide her behind the courage of her new friends. She took a breath, clutched the folded papers in her skirt, and walked forward from the side of the house into the open. "I believe you are looking for me, Marshal," she said. Her voice was clearer and stronger than she had expected. Boone's smile widened. "Abigail, I knew you would see reason. It is time to come home. I have no home with you, Mr. Boone, and I have no debt." She pulled the promissory note from her skirt and held it up. "This is a forgery. My father's signature was not this clumsy scrawl. He was an artist with a pen, just as he was with a hammer." Pike sighed. A theatrical display of weary patience. "We have been over this. Miss, the note has been certified. I have a witness who was present at the signing." He nodded to the grimy miner. "A man named Jebediah. Tell them what you saw. Jeb." Jebediah shifted uncomfortably in his saddle, refusing to meet Abigail's eyes. "I saw it. I was there. I saw Samuel Whitfield make his mark." He was worried, said he needed the loan for a new shipment of iron. It was a clumsy lie, but in the face of the marshal's authority, it was a powerful one. Abigail saw the trap closing. It was her word against theirs, and they held all the power. Chaska moved then, not toward the riders, but to stand a few feet from Abigail's side. He did not speak, but his presence was a clear statement. He was with her. Pike's eyes narrowed, seizing the opportunity. "And there is your proof. The Lakota is interfering, aiding and abetting. He is obstructing the law." He pointed directly at Chaska. "You are under arrest." Two of his men dismounted, their rifles held ready. They moved toward Chaska, who stood his ground, his expression unreadable. "You cannot do this," Miguel shouted, stepping off the porch. "He has done nothing." "He is harboring a fugitive and preventing a marshal from carrying out his duty. That is enough." Pike's voice had a ring of finality. The men grabbed Chaska's arms. He did not resist, but his body went rigid, a statue of coiled strength. They twisted his arms behind his back and bound his wrists with a leather thong. The sight of him, so proud and capable, being restrained like a common criminal, broke something inside Abigail. This was her fault. They were using him to get to her. "Stop!" she cried out, her voice raw. She stepped in front of the two men holding Chaska. "Let him go. This has nothing to do with him. This is between me and Mr. Boone." Boone chuckled, a low, ugly sound. "Everything in this territory has to do with me, my dear. He has made your business his own. Now he will pay the price." "No," Abigail said, her mind racing. "This is not how justice works. Not even here. You cannot just arrest a man without a trial." Pike laughed. "A trial? We are having one right now. My witness says one thing, you say another. I am the law, and I believe my witness." Case closed. Her anonymity was gone. Hiding had failed. There was only one thing left to do. She had to risk everything. Right here, right now. "My name is Abigail Whitfield," she declared, her voice ringing across the dusty yard. "Daughter of Samuel Whitfield, and I accuse Silas Boone of fraud, and you, Marshal Pike, of conspiring with him to steal my land." A shocked silence fell over the yard. Boone's smile vanished, replaced by a flash of fury. Pike's face turned a mottled red. "You have no proof," he snarled. "I have this forged note, and I have the testimony of my own 2 eyes. I will tell my story to anyone who will listen, to every miner, every rancher, every decent person in this territory. Let us have a real hearing. Not here, in the dirt, with your hired guns as the jury. Let us go to the town. Let us have a public meeting where the truth can be heard." It was a desperate gamble, a wild leap of faith in a community she had only just begun to know. Pike was about to refuse, to end this farce with force, when another figure emerged from the Delgado's cabin. It was 2 Moons. He had been inside, observing the entire exchange in silence. He walked slowly out onto the porch, his ancient eyes missing nothing. He did not look at the armed men, but at Miguel Delgado. He spoke in his own language, his voice quiet but carrying a profound authority. Miguel nodded and then turned to the marshal. "The elder suggests a different path," Miguel said, translating. "He says a court with guns is not a court. It is an ambush. He suggests a talking session, a public council. Let the girl speak. Let Mr. Boone speak. Let others from the town be invited to listen. The new blacksmith, who knew Samuel Whitfield's work and his word. The pastor, who knows the good book's teachings on false witness. Let the people hear both sides and decide for themselves where the truth lies." It was a masterstroke of diplomacy. The suggestion was so reasonable, so deeply rooted in a sense of fairness, that to refuse it would expose Pike and Boone as the tyrants they were. They had counted on a swift, isolated confrontation. They were not prepared for a public debate. Pike hesitated, glancing at Boone. He saw the fury in the man's eyes, but he also saw the logic. To arrest Chaska and drag Abigail away by force in front of the Delgados and this serene, unmovable old man would be a messy business. It would create talk. Edie Quinn, the reporter, was already sniffing around. He made his decision. Fine, he spat out, the word tasting like poison in his mouth. "We will have your little talk, but until then, the Lakota is my prisoner. He stays under guard." 2 Moons spoke again, his voice calm. Chaska nodded to Miguel. "He will remain," Miguel said, "and we will all come to town to speak." Pike looked from Abigail's defiant face to Chaska's stoic calm, to the unyielding solidarity of the Delgados and the quiet wisdom in the old man's eyes. He had been outmaneuvered. He barked an order, and his men untied Chaska, though 2 of them remained near him, their rifles a constant threat. The immediate crisis was over, but the air was thick with unresolved tension. Pike turned his horse, his face a mask of cold fury. He looked directly at Abigail. "You have made a mistake, girl." Silas Boone leaned forward in his saddle, his voice a low, vicious promise meant only for her. "This changes nothing. I will have what is mine, one way or another." Then they wheeled their horses around and rode away, leaving a cloud of red dust and a heavy, ringing silence in their wake. Abigail looked at Chaska, who was now free but not yet safe. They had won a brief reprieve, a chance to fight, but they had also declared open war. The sky, which had been a brilliant, cloudless blue, began to change. A gray pallor crept in from the west, the color of a bruise. The air grew heavy and still, the kind of oppressive quiet that comes before a violent break. The birds fell silent. Even the insects seemed to be holding their breath. The confrontation with Pike and Boone had left a similar charged stillness, a sense of a storm about to break. It began with a few fat, sporadic drops of rain that hissed in the dust. Then, a low rumble of thunder echoed from the Black Hills, and the heavens opened. It was not a gentle rain, but a deluge, a solid sheet of water that turned the dusty ground to a thick, running mud in minutes. The creek, which had been a placid ribbon of water, began to swell and churn, its color turning from clear to a murky brown. They had moved their small camp to higher ground, anticipating the storm, But they watched as other families, caught unawares, scrambled to get their wagons and children away from the rising water. The creek became a monster, a roaring, debris-choked torrent that tore at its banks, pulling in bushes and small trees. Suddenly, a cry of alarm went up. A wagon, its wheels hopelessly mired in the mud near the bank, was in danger of being swept away. Two small children, who had been playing nearby, were trapped on a sliver of land that was rapidly disappearing, the floodwaters swirling around them. Their mother screamed from the opposite bank, helpless. There was no time for a plan. Chaska was already moving. He grabbed a long rope from the Delgado's wagon and, tying one end around his waist and the other to a sturdy cottonwood, began to wade into the torrent. The current was immensely powerful, and it took all his strength just to stay upright. Abigail, her heart in her throat, watched him fight his way across. She looked at the terrified children, then at the frantic mother. She saw a coil of lighter rope in the wagon bed. Without a second thought, she grabbed it and followed Chaska's path, moving along the bank to a point upstream from the children. The mud sucked at her boots, trying to pull her down. Chaska reached the eroding piece of land and gathered the children, a boy and a girl, holding them tight. He shouted something to her over the roar of the water, but she could not hear. She did not need to. She understood. He was the anchor. She had to be the lifeline. She tied a heavy rock to the end of her rope and, with a desperate heave, threw it across the churning water to him. He caught it, untied the rock, and secured the rope around the oldest child. He pointed back to Abigail, then to Miguel, who had come to stand beside her. They began to pull, hand over hand, drawing the terrified, crying child through the waist-deep water to the safety of the bank. They sent the rope back, and a minute later, the second child was safe, wrapped in Rosa's shawl, shivering but unharmed. Now it was Chaska's turn. The land where he stood crumbled away completely, and he was swept into the main current, saved only by the heavy rope around his waist. Abigail and Miguel dug their heels into the mud and pulled, their muscles straining, until he too was dragged onto the bank, gasping for air, his body bruised but whole. The floodwaters raged for another hour, and then, as quickly as it had begun, the rain stopped. The sun broke through the clouds, and the water began to recede, leaving behind a world that had been violently scoured clean. The air was fresh and cool, and the land, though scarred, seemed new. The next afternoon, as they were helping the stranded families salvage what they could, a new threat appeared. 3 rough-looking men on horseback were approaching a supply wagon that had become stuck in the deep mud on the main track. The driver, an old man named Jeb, was alone and vulnerable. The men were not offering help. Their intent was clear in the way they circled the wagon, like buzzards moving in on a kill. "There is trouble," Chaska said, his voice low. The men were too far away to confront directly, and they were armed. Abigail's hand went instinctively to her skirt, where the small weight of the derringer was a constant reminder of her new reality. All of Chaska's lessons came rushing back to her. Breathe, squeeze, let the gun be surprised. She looked at Chaska. He saw the resolve in her eyes and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. She pulled out the pistol. Her hand was steady. Her fear was a cold, quiet thing now, not a frantic panic. It was a tool, like the fire and the knife. She was not aiming at the men. She was aiming at the large front wheel of the wagon. She remembered Chaska's words, a quiet voice that speaks the truth. Her truth was that these people would not be harmed. She took a breath, let it out slowly, and squeezed the trigger. The crack of the small pistol was sharp and clear in the quiet afternoon. A splinter of wood flew from the wagon wheel. The 3 men froze, startled. They looked around wildly, trying to find the source of the shot. They could not see her. Hidden as she was among the rocks and trees, the shot had not been a threat to their lives, but it was a clear and undeniable message. "You are being watched," You are not alone." After a moment of tense hesitation, the men exchanged uneasy glances. This was not the easy robbery they had anticipated. They wheeled their horses around and galloped away, disappearing over the rise. Abigail lowered the gun, the smell of gunpowder sharp in her nostrils. A strange mix of emotions washed over her. There was a profound sense of horror at what she had just done, at the line she had crossed. But beneath it, there was a fierce, undeniable spark of pride. She had not been a victim. She had not waited to be rescued. She had acted. She had protected someone. She looked at Chaska. He said nothing, but the look in his eyes was all the approval she needed. Later that day, Edie Quinn, the reporter, found them. Her horse was spattered with mud, and her clothes were damp, but her eyes were bright with excitement. She had ridden hard from Dead Mule. "I have something for you," she said to Abigail, dismounting and pulling a small, oilskin-wrapped package from her saddlebag. It came by way of a very determined French Creole woman who insisted I deliver it personally. Inside was a small, leather-bound ledger. Abigail opened it. The pages were filled with neat columns of names and numbers, dates, amounts, and purposes. Payments to Marshall Pike, payments to Jebediah, the false witness, payments for land claims, for supplies, for silence. It was Silas Boone's account book, a meticulous record of his corruption. "This changes everything," Abigail whispered, staring at the pages. "This is the proof." "It is a weapon," Edie corrected her, a knowing look on her face, "and a weapon is only as good as the person who wields it." That evening, as they sat around the Delgado's fire, the mood was one of wary optimism. The ledger was a powerful tool, but Boone and Pike were still dangerous. Miguel Delgado looked out at the land, at the rich soil exposed by the flood and the green pastures untouched by the fire. "This land," he said, his voice thoughtful, "it gives us so much, but it asks us to be smart. The fire, the flood, the drought that will come next year, we cannot fight them alone." He looked around the circle, at his wife, Rosa, at Chaska and 2 Moons, at Abigail. What if we did not fight each other for the water? What if we shared it? What if we built a channel from the Blue Notch Spring, a ditch that fed all our lands, mine, the other homesteaders, your people's camp? We could share the work, share the water, and stand together against the fire and the drought. We could build something that lasts. It was a radical idea in a land where every man fought for himself. It was a seed of a new kind of community, one not of blood or nation, but of choice and mutual need. 2 Moons nodded slowly, a deep approval in his ancient eyes. It was a good thought, a path to harmony. Later, when the others had gone to bed, Abigail and Chaska sat by the dying embers of the fire. The shared danger and the trials of the past days had forged a new intimacy between them. "The man I was supposed to marry before I came to this territory. He was like Boone," Abigail said softly, her voice barely audible over the chirping of the crickets. "He did not see me. He saw a wife, a possession, something to complete the picture of his life. I ran from him, just like I ran from Boone. All I have ever wanted is a life that is my own." Chaska stared into the fire, his face etched in shadow and light. "My people did not run," he said, his voice low and heavy with a grief that was generations deep. "We stood our ground on the land that was our home, and the treaties were broken, one by one. The promises turned to dust. They took the land, piece by piece, to be told that the place where your ancestors are buried is no longer yours, that you are a stranger in your own home. It is a pain that has no name." They sat in silence for a long time, 2 people from different worlds, their separate paths of pain converging in the quiet darkness. He had lost a home he could never reclaim. She was fighting for a home she had not yet built. Abigail took off the blue scarf she wore in her hair and began to clean the barrel of the Derringer with it. The simple, domestic act was a declaration. She was no longer just running. She was preparing for the next fight. When she was done, she draped the scarf over a low branch to dry in the clean night air. It fluttered in the gentle breeze, a small flag of defiance and hard-won freedom. The next morning, under a sky washed clean by the storm, Abigail found Chaska by the corral, mending a piece of tack. The Delgados were nearby, pitching hay, and 2 moons sat on the porch, carving a piece of wood. The air was filled with the simple, peaceful sounds of work. Abigail walked over to Chaska, her steps deliberate, her resolve a hard knot in her stomach. The events of the past few days, the flood, the confrontation with the bandits, had burned away the last of her hesitation. She stopped in front of him. "Teach me to fight," she said. The words came out quiet, but they carried the weight of her entire journey. It was not a plea but a demand, of him and of herself. Her voice was steady, but a faint tremor of fear ran beneath it. Chaska stopped his work and looked up at her. He saw the fire in her eyes, the set of her jaw. He saw the woman who had faced down a flash flood and fired a gun to save a stranger. A slow, unexpected smile touched the corner of his mouth, a rare sight that made him look younger, less burdened. He glanced over at Miguel and Rosa, who had paused their work to listen, and then at 2 moons, whose hands had stilled. A playful glint entered his eyes. "First lesson," he said, his voice just loud enough for the others to hear. "How to be my wife." A surprised laugh broke from Miguel. Rosa covered her mouth to hide a wide smile, and even 2 Moon's wrinkled face crinkled with silent amusement. Abigail felt a hot blush creep up her neck, a startling mix of embarrassment and a strange, fluttering warmth. She was about to stammer a retort, but Chaska raised a hand, his expression shifting from teasing to a deep seriousness. "Partner," he corrected himself, his gaze locking with hers. "First lesson, how to be my partner. Fighting is not about the gun. It is not about the knife. It is about knowing the person next to you will stand their ground. It means keeping each other alive." The lessons that followed were of a different kind. He taught her to shoot not just at a stationary target, but from the saddle of a moving horse, to feel the rhythm of the animal's gait and fire in the smooth space between strides. Her arms, strong from her father's forge, grew steady. The fear of the weapon did not vanish, but it was overshadowed by a growing competence. He taught her the silent language of the hands. A flat palm held out meant stop. A circling finger meant look around. 2 fingers pointed forward meant go on ahead. They would practice across a field, communicating complex ideas without a single word, a secret dialogue that belonged only to them. He taught her how to disappear, how to use the shadow of a rock, the cover of a stand of brush, how to walk on dry leaves without a sound, how to read the wind to keep her scent from carrying to whatever she was tracking, or whatever was tracking her. His 2 core principles were repeated until they were etched into her mind. Do not shoot if you do not have to. A threat avoided is a greater victory than a threat destroyed. And a battle is only won if your people are still standing when it is over. A week after the flood, a grim reality set in. The public meeting they had gambled on was still days away, and Boone was not a man to wait for the law, especially when he owned it. "We need to know what he is doing at Blue Notch," Chaska said one evening. "Words in town are one thing, a fence on the land is another." "I will go with you," Abigail said. It was not a question. They rode out before dawn. Leaving the sleeping homestead behind, they moved through the hills like ghosts, using the lessons Chaska had taught her, staying off the main trails, their communication a series of quiet hand signals. The land itself felt tense, as if holding its breath. When they reached the ridge overlooking the spring, Abigail's heart sank. A raw, ugly scar of freshly cut timber and sharp wire stretched across the land, enclosing the spring and a wide area around it. A new wooden shack stood near the water, a curl of smoke rising from its chimney. Two men with rifles lounged on the porch. Boone had not waited. He had seized the water, daring anyone to challenge him. The law was a fence and a gun. "He has already won," Abigail whispered, the words tasting of defeat. "No," Chaska said, his voice a low, hard rumble. "He has only shown his hand. He thinks his fence is the end of the story. For my people, a fence is just a temporary line. The water still flows beneath it." They watched for an hour, memorizing the layout of the camp, the number of guards, the rhythm of their patrols. Then, satisfied they had seen enough, they began the long, careful ride back. They were halfway to the Delgado Ranch, moving through a narrow pass with steep, sandy walls, when the trap was sprung. The crack of a rifle echoed through the pass, and a puff of dust exploded from a rock just inches from Chaska's head. 3 riders appeared on the ridge above them, blocking their path forward. 2 more emerged from the rocks behind them, cutting off their retreat. They were caught. There was nowhere to run. Chaska drew his revolver, his face a grim mask of concentration. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and exposed. Abigail's mind raced, her fear a sharp, cold spike. She looked at the sandy walls of the pass, at the dry creek bed they were riding in. Then she looked at the ground just ahead of the riders in front of them. The sand there had a different look, a darker, wetter sheen, where a small side spring seeped almost invisibly into the ground. It looked solid, but she had seen a stray calf get mired in a place just like it a few days before. She spurred her horse forward, a sudden, panicked bolt directly toward the 2 riders in front. "What are you doing?" Chaska yelled, his voice sharp with alarm. It was a crazy move, a desperate flight toward the enemy. The men on the ridge laughed, raising their rifles to take easy aim at the foolish girl. The 2 men blocking the path spurred their own horses forward to intercept her. Abigail leaned low over her mare's neck, urging her on, her eyes fixed on that patch of dark sand. She veered at the last possible second, her horse's hooves finding purchase on a narrow strip of solid ground to the side. The 2 riders, focused only on her, were not so careful. They plunged straight into the trap. Their horses hit the wet sand and immediately sank to their knees, letting out terrified squeals. The ground, which had looked so solid, was a deep, sucking mire. The men cursed, trying to pull their panicked animals free, but every struggle only sank them deeper. In seconds, they were hopelessly stuck, their horses flailing, the men shouting in a mixture of anger and fear. The 3 riders on the ridge were so stunned by the sudden turn of events that they hesitated for a crucial moment. That was all Chaska needed. He fired 2 quick shots, not at the men, but at the loose rocks above their heads. A shower of stone and gravel rained down, forcing them to duck for cover and abandon their clear shots. "Now," Chaska yelled to Abigail. They spurred their horses past the foundered riders and galloped out of the pass, leaving a scene of chaos and confusion behind them. They did not stop riding until they were miles away, hidden deep in a grove of cottonwoods. They dismounted, their horses heaving for breath, their own bodies trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline. Abigail slid from the saddle, her knees weak. "That was a good plan," Chaska said, his voice quiet, filled with a respect that was more meaningful to her than any praise. "You saw with your eyes, not just with your fear." She looked up at him, the reality of what had just happened settling over her. They had been so close to death. She had seen the rifle pointed at him, and in that instant, she had known a terror worse than any she had felt for her own life. "If you had fallen back there," she said, her voice unsteady, "if they had hurt you, I do not think I could live in silence anymore." Chaska stepped closer, his hand coming up to gently cup her jaw, his thumb brushing away a smudge of dust from her cheek. His touch was warm and steady, a grounding force in a world that had just tried to tear itself apart. "Then we will live out loud," he said softly, "together." The day of the so-called public meeting arrived not with the impartial light of the sun, but under the cloak of a moonless night. Marshal Pike, it seemed, preferred to conduct his justice in the dark. In the center of Dead Mule's main street, a makeshift tribunal had been assembled on the bed of a large freight wagon. Torches were stuck in barrels, casting long, dancing shadows that made familiar faces seem like grotesque masks. The whole affair felt less like a hearing and more like a prelude to a hanging. Silas Boone stood beside the wagon, his arms crossed, a smug look of certainty on his face. Pike, perched on a crate that served as his judge's bench, held a gavel in his hand like a weapon. A handful of Boone's hired guns were positioned strategically around the square, their presence a clear and unspoken threat. Abigail, Chaska, the Delgados, and 2 Moons had ridden into town together, a small island of solidarity in a sea of uncertainty. Edie Quinn met them at the edge of the square, her reporter's notebook in hand, her eyes missing nothing. The word that she and Miguel had spread had brought people out. Miners with shoulders stooped from their work. The new blacksmith whose face was perpetually smudged with soot, homesteading families, and the town pastor, a thin, stoic man named Reverend Miller. They were a curious and uneasy crowd, drawn by the promise of a spectacle. Pike slammed the gavel down on the crate, the sharp sound echoing in the tense quiet. "This meeting will come to order. We are here to resolve the matter of the fugitive, Abigail Whitfield, and the interference of the Lakota known as Chaska." He called Chaska to stand before the wagon. 2 of Pike's men shoved him forward. He stood there, his wrists still unbound, his posture straight, his face calm. He looked not like a prisoner, but like a man observing a peculiar and slightly foolish ceremony. "This man," Pike declared, pointing a thick finger at Chaska, "has not only aided a runaway, but has actively resisted a lawman in the performance of his duties. He led an ambush against me and my deputies. He is a dangerous influence, a spark that seeks to set this territory ablaze."
"He is a hero,"
Miguel Delgado's voice boomed from the crowd. "He saved my ranch and my family from the fire." "That is a separate matter," Pike snapped, his composure already fraying. "The charge is obstruction and inciting rebellion, the punishment for which is swift." He was moving too fast, trying to rush to a verdict before any real argument could be made. Abigail knew she had to act, but before she could speak, Edie Quinn stepped out from the crowd and walked toward the wagon, her steps measured and fearless. "Marshal," she said, her voice clear and carrying, "you mentioned justice. I have in my possession a document that might shed some light on the nature of justice in Dead Mule. With the community gathered, I feel it is my duty as a member of the press to share it." Before Pike could object, she opened the small leather ledger. She did not have to raise her voice. The crowd was so silent that her words fell like stones into a deep well. An entry, dated the 3rd of May, she began, "To Marshal Harlan Pike, for the certification of certain financial documents, $50. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. Pike's face went pale in the torchlight. Another entry, dated the 10th of May, to Jebediah Kane, for services as a witness, $10 and 1 bottle of whiskey. The crowd's murmur grew louder, angrier. Men turned to look at each other, their expressions of disbelief hardening into resentment. The miners, who lived on a few dollars a day and Boone's credit at the company store, looked as if they had been struck.
"Stop this!"
Pike roared, finding his voice. "This is slander. It is inadmissible." Edie Quinn simply continued, her voice cutting through his bluster. Another, dated the 20th of May, a payment to a surveyor for a report on railroad water rights adjacent to the Blue Notch Spring. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place for everyone to see. It was not about a debt. It was not about a runaway girl. It was about water, land, and the railroad. It was about greed, pure and simple. The miners began to shout, their voices a low, rumbling chorus of anger. They knew what it felt like to be cheated by Boone, and now they saw the law itself was a part of the swindle. Reverend Miller stepped forward, his thin frame holding a surprising authority.
Marshal Pike,
he said, his voice quiet but firm. Justice cannot be done in the shadows. This is a serious accusation, supported by what appears to be evidence. This business requires the light of day. It requires a proper court, not a torch-lit assembly. Pike, seeing the crowd turning against him, losing the control he so desperately needed, completely lost his temper. He drew his revolver, the click of the hammer cocking a sharp, ugly sound in the night. He fired a single shot straight up into the air. The explosion shocked the crowd into silence. Women gasped, and men took a step back.
I am the law here,
Pike bellowed, his face contorted with rage, the gun smoking in his hand,
and I will have order.
In that moment of terrified silence, Abigail moved. She did not run. She did not hide. She walked forward, her steps shaky but determined, until she was standing directly in front of the marshal's wagon, placing her own body between the crowd and the barrel of his gun. Her hands were trembling at her sides, but her chin was high. "You are not the law, Marshal," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "You are a bully with a badge. And you, Mr. Boone, you think your money can buy anything, land, water, people, but you cannot buy consent. You cannot buy respect. That has to be earned. You do not own me. You do not own this land." The sheer audacity of her defiance held everyone transfixed. For a moment, it seemed as if the whole town was holding its breath. Then, the moment broke. Boone's hired men, seeing the situation escalating, moved forward, their hands on their pistols. They formed a loose line in front of the wagon, a human wall separating Boone and Pike from the town. On the other side, the blacksmith, a burly man with arms like tree trunks, took a step forward to stand near Abigail. Miguel and a few other ranchers moved to join him. The crowd of miners, their faces grim, did not move back. They held their ground. The main street of Dead Mule was now a powder keg. The people split into two armed, angry camps. A single wrong move, a single nervous twitch of a finger, would erupt into a bloodbath. It was then that Chaska, who had been watching everything with a preternatural calm, acted. He did not reach for a weapon. He did not shout. He took 2 slow steps to his left. It was a small movement, almost unnoticeable in the chaos, but it was executed with the precision of a master strategist. His new position placed him directly behind Reverend Miller and Edie Quinn. He looked straight at Pike, his dark eyes seeming to see right through the marshal's blustering rage. He spoke, his voice low and conversational, yet it cut through the tension like a razor. "Are you going to shoot me, Marshal?" he asked. "To do it, you will have to aim your gun through a woman of the press and a man of God. Think of the story Miss Quinn will write tomorrow. Think of the sermon the Reverend will preach on Sunday." Pike froze, the gun in his hand suddenly feeling impossibly heavy. He looked down the barrel and saw what Chaska had forced him to see. Not just the Lakota he despised, but the 2 people in town who represented truth and morality. To shoot now would not be an act of law enforcement. It would be an act of pure villainy, witnessed by the entire town. He was trapped, not by force, but by the power of perception. He wavered, his face a storm of conflicting emotions, rage, humiliation, and the cold dawning realization that he had been completely outplayed. With a final, inarticulate roar of frustration, he lowered the gun. The trial was over. The night court had collapsed. Boone, his face like a thundercloud, grabbed Pike by the arm. "Enough!" he hissed. He pulled the marshal back from the edge of the wagon, his eyes sweeping over the defiant faces of Abigail, Chaska, and the townspeople who stood with them. He looked at Abigail, and the look in his eyes was more terrifying than Pike's gun. It was a look of cold, calculated hatred. He had been publicly humiliated. He had lost control. But he was not defeated. As he and his men began to back away, melting into the darkness at the edge of town, his retreat felt not like a surrender, but like a tactical withdrawal. He was a man who, having failed to win with the law, would now turn to a lawlessness of his own making. The dawn that followed the failed night court was sullen and hot. A strange, dry wind blew from the south, carrying not relief but a sense of foreboding. The townspeople went about their morning chores with a nervous energy, casting watchful eyes toward the hills, as if expecting the fragile peace to be broken at any moment. They did not have to wait long. It began as a faint smudge of smoke on the southern horizon, in the direction of the Delgado Ranch and the Lakota camp beyond. At first, it was dismissed as a small cooking fire, but the smudge grew, darkening and spreading with an unnatural speed, climbing into the sky like a dirty brown fist. It was no campfire. It was the prairie itself, burning. A cry of alarm went up from the end of the street, and in moments, the town was in an uproar. Men ran for horses, grabbing buckets and shovels. Silas Boone's malice had taken a new, monstrous form. He had failed to break their spirit with the law, so now he would use the oldest and most indiscriminate weapon of all: fire. His plan was brutally clear: burn out the Delgados, destroy the Lakota camp, and let the embers carry the lie that the natives themselves had started the blaze. Abigail, Chaska, and Miguel were already on horseback, galloping south toward the inferno. The heat rolled toward them in waves, and the air grew thick with choking smoke. But as they crested the last rise before the Delgado homestead, a new and terrible thing happened. The wind, which had been driving the fire steadily northward, faltered. It swirled in confusion for a moment, and then, with a great, moaning roar, it shifted, turning on itself. The southern wind died, and a new, powerful gale blew in from the northwest. The wall of fire, 100 feet high and a mile wide, changed direction. It was no longer moving parallel to the town. It was now a ravenous beast, turning its full fury directly on Dead Mule itself. They wheeled their horses around, racing the fire back toward the town they had just left. The panicked flight to help others had become a desperate scramble to save themselves. The town that had been a place of division and corruption was now the last bastion of survival for everyone, friend and foe alike. By the time they reached the main street, chaos reigned. People were running in every direction, some trying to load wagons with their meager possessions, others simply standing frozen in terror. Marshal Pike was shouting orders that no one was listening to, his authority having evaporated in the face of a true crisis. It was Abigail who found her voice first. Her fear was a cold, hard knot inside her, but her father's practicality, the blacksmith's instinct to see a problem and find a tool to fix it, took over. "Water!" she yelled, her voice cutting through the panic. "We need a line to the water tank, buckets, pots, anything that will hold water." The women and older children, who had been milling in confusion, turned to look at her. They saw not a runaway girl, but a leader. Her command was simple, direct, and gave them purpose. Rosa Delgado was at her side in an instant. Together, they began to organize the chaos. A human chain formed, stretching from the large communal water tank at the center of town to the southern edge, where the first buildings stood in the fire's path. Women, children, the elderly shopkeeper, even Tante May, her face grim and determined, passed buckets, pots, and pans from hand to hand. It was a pitifully small stream against a tidal wave of fire, but it was a stand. While Abigail rallied the town's heart, Chaska and Miguel organized its muscle. "We cannot stop it with water alone," Chaska shouted to the blacksmith and the miners who had gathered around him. "We need to starve it. We need a fire break." They grabbed axes, shovels, and plows, working with a desperate speed. They began to tear a wide trench in the earth at the south end of town, ripping up the dry grass and brush, creating a scar of bare dirt that they prayed the fire could not cross. Two Moons, who had watched the wind shift with an ancient, knowing sadness, gathered a small group of the older men around him. He pointed to the trees at the edge of the forest, just west of the town. "The fire will take the forest." His voice was calm amid the roar. "We must fight fire with fire." He showed them how to light a controlled backfire, a smaller, deliberate blaze that would burn toward the main inferno, consuming the fuel in its path and creating a blackened, fireproof barrier to save the vital timber. It was a dangerous, delicate art, a dance with the very element that threatened to destroy them all. The main fire hit the edge of town like a physical blow. The heat was a solid wall. The sound, a deafening, continuous roar that shook the very ground. The first outbuildings exploded into flame. The bucket brigade worked with frantic speed, dousing the roofs of the nearest houses, their small splashes of water turning instantly to steam. The men at the firebreak dug like madmen, the smoke burning their lungs, the heat blistering their skin. And then, through the swirling smoke and chaos, Abigail saw him. Silas Boone. He was on horseback at the edge of the square, his face a mask of insane fury. His plan had backfired. The town he sought to control was being destroyed, but the community he sought to break was being forged in the flames. He saw them working together, united against him, and he could not stand it. He raised a pistol. He was not aiming at a person. He was aiming at the wooden water tank, the town's single source of life in this inferno. If he could destroy it, all hope would be lost. Everything went silent for Abigail. The roar of the fire, the shouts of the people, it all faded away. There was only Boone, the gun in his hand, and the certain knowledge of what she had to do. The line she had been so afraid to cross was no longer a line. It was a necessity. She dropped the bucket she was holding and pulled the small derringer from her skirt. Her hand was perfectly steady. Her heart was a cold, hard stone. She did not aim for his chest. She did not aim for his head. She aimed for the hand that held the gun.
Breathe. Squeeze. Let the gun be surprised.
The small pistol bucked in her hand. The crack of the shot was almost lost in the roar of the fire, but its effect was absolute. Boone cried out, a sharp, strangled sound, and dropped his pistol. He clutched his right hand, where a dark red stain was already spreading across his white cuff. He stared at his bleeding hand, then looked across the square at Abigail, his face a perfect picture of shocked disbelief. At that exact moment, Marshal Pike, who had been uselessly trying to organize a retreat, saw his chance. He saw Boone wounded, his power broken. He saw the entire town witness Boone's attempt to sabotage their survival. He saw the wind of public opinion shift as violently as the prairie wind had. He drew his own revolver and strode toward Boone. "Silas Boone, you are under arrest for arson and attempted murder," he declared in his loudest, most official voice. It was a masterful piece of theater, but Edie Quinn, her face smudged with soot, stood nearby, her pencil flying across the page of her notebook, recording not just the marshal's timely heroism, but the long moments of his cowardice that had preceded it. The fight for the town raged for another hour, but with Boone's threat neutralized and the firebreak finally complete, the tide began to turn. The backfire set by Two Moons saved the forest, and the relentless work of the Bucket Brigade saved the core of the town. The Great Fire, finding no more fuel, swept past the western edge of Dead Mule and roared off into the northern prairie, its fury spent. The town still stood, charred, smoking, and wounded, but it stood. In the exhausted, smoke-filled silence, the townspeople slowly came together in the main square. They looked at each other, their faces black with soot, their bodies aching. They were no longer just miners, ranchers, and shopkeepers. They were survivors. They had faced the inferno and won. Pike shoved the wounded Silas Boone, his hand crudely bandaged, toward the town's small jail. The crowd did not cheer. They watched in a low, simmering silence, their collective contempt a heavier judgment than any court could deliver. One of Pike's deputies entered Boone's office and emerged with a stack of papers, the fraudulent deeds and claims, to the blue notch spring among them. The town, born from a lie, had been cleansed by fire. The fire was gone, but it had left its ghost. A gray haze hung in the morning air, and the sharp, acrid smell of burned prairie and charred pine was the new scent of dead mule. The sun rose into a sky veiled by smoke, casting a weak orange light on a town that was wounded but still breathing. The silence of the dawn was broken not by the usual clatter of commerce, but by the rhythmic scrape of shovels against dirt and the low murmur of neighbors speaking to one another as they began the immense task of cleaning up. There were no longer separate groups of miners, ranchers, or shopkeepers. There were only survivors, their faces smudged with the same soot, their movements weary but unified. By mid-morning, a special edition of the Dakota Pioneer appeared. Edie Quinn, having worked through the night by the light of a single lantern, had printed a single sheet, front and back. It was not filled with sensationalism or hyperbole. It was a cold, methodical account of Silas Boone's conspiracy, laid out in black and white. She had printed excerpts from his own ledger, the columns of bribes and payments, a stark confession in his own hand. She detailed the forged promissory note, the false witness, the calculated plan to seize the Blue Notch Spring, and the final, desperate act of arson. The paper passed from hand to hand, and as people read, their quiet anger from the night before hardened into a cold, unbreakable resolve. The truth was no longer a rumor whispered in the dark. It was a public record. The trial, when it came, was not held in a courtroom. It was held in the open air of the main square, right beside the blackened earth of the firebreak that had saved them. A circuit judge was said to be days away, summoned by a rider sent out at dawn. But the people of Dead Mule were not waiting for a stranger to tell them what they already knew. This was their town, their justice. Silas Boone, his bandaged hand a dirty white flag of his defeat, was brought from the jail. He was no longer the confident tyrant, but a sullen, silent man who refused to meet the eyes of the people he had tried to destroy. Harlan Pike stood beside him, stripped of his badge, his face a miserable mask of humiliation. Reverend Miller convened the assembly. He did not speak of vengeance, but of restoration. The new blacksmith, a man named Thomas, was the first to speak. He held up the forged promissory note. "Samuel Whitfield was my friend," he said, his voice deep and steady. "He taught me the trade. I know his hand. He could sign his name in steel with a hammer and tongs, and it had more grace than this chicken scratch. He was an honest man. This paper is an insult to his memory." Next came one of the senior miners, a man whose face was a roadmap of a hard life. "We all have debts to Mr. Boone," he said, his voice rough with coal dust and emotion. "Debts at his store for food, for tools. He kept us on a leash made of credit. We saw him cheat this girl, and we were afraid to speak because we were afraid of that leash. We were wrong. The fear ends today." The testimony continued, a quiet chorus of truth. When it was done, there was no need for a verdict. The guilt of the two men was a palpable thing, a suffocating presence in the clear light of day. Thomas the blacksmith stepped forward and publicly removed the star from Pike's shirt. The former marshal simply slumped, a man hollowed out. Boone was led back to his cell to await the circuit judge. The murmurs of the crowd a heavier sentence than any official pronouncement. In the afternoon, the work of rebuilding began in earnest. Miguel Delgado called a meeting, not of accusation, but of creation. He stood on the porch of the saloon, his voice carrying over the crowd. "The fire taught us a hard lesson," he said. "This land is hard, but it is harder if we fight each other." Silas Boone wanted to own the water. He wanted to put a fence around life itself and sell it back to us. "I say the water belongs to no one, so it belongs to everyone." He unrolled a crude map he had drawn on a piece of hide. He proposed a plan not of division, but of connection, a single main irrigation channel, to be dug from the Blue Notch Spring. It would be a community project, with every able-bodied person contributing their labor. The channel would feed the fields of the homesteaders. It would water the pastures for the ranch. It would run to a cistern for the Lakota camp, and it would refill the town's own water tank. They would share the work, and they would share the water. A lifeline held in common. A cheer went up from the crowd. It was a simple, elegant solution, an act of creation in the face of destruction. In that moment, a new covenant was forged, not on paper, but in the shared understanding of a community that had been tested by fire and had not broken. As the meeting broke up and people began to organize into work crews, Thomas the blacksmith approached Abigail. He stood before her, his hat in his hands. On behalf of this town, "Miss," he said, his voice thick with sincerity, "I want to apologize. We saw what was happening. We saw the injustice, and we looked away. You were braver than all of us. You reminded us what it means to stand up for what is right." Abigail was so taken aback she could not speak. Before she could find her words, a familiar voice cut through the air. "Well, it is about time you all came to your senses." Tante May pushed through the crowd, her face a mixture of relief and stern affection. She ignored everyone else and pulled Abigail into a fierce, tight hug. She held her at arm's length, looking her up and down. "You are too thin," she declared, "and you have soot on your face, but you have iron in your spine. Your father would be so proud." Tears welled in Abigail's eyes, tears of relief and homecoming. "Now," Tante May continued, a mischievous twinkle in her eye as she glanced over at Chaska, who was standing nearby, watching them with a quiet smile. "Since we have all survived this little barbecue, I believe you owe me. You owe me a wedding party the likes of which this territory has never seen." Abigail's face flushed a brilliant red, but this time she laughed along with everyone else, the sound of it light and free. Later, as the afternoon sun began to dip toward the hills, Chaska stood alone, watching a group of younger boys clearing debris from a burned-out shed. One of them, a lanky boy of about 15 named Willie Crow, worked with a quiet intensity that set him apart. He was of mixed heritage, a boy who lived between worlds, and he watched Chaska with a look of undisguised admiration. Chaska walked over to him. "You have a strong back, Willie," he said, "and you have good eyes. I saw you during the fire. You were not panicked. You were watching, learning." The boy flushed with pride but said nothing. Chaska pulled the knife from the sheath at his belt. It was a simple tool, but the handle was carved from dark wood in the shape of a hawk, its wings folded, its eyes sharp. He held it out to the boy. "This was given to me by my uncle," he said. "He told me the hawk sees everything. It watches over the land and the people. Its job is not to seek fights, but to protect the nest, to be a guardian." Willie stared at the knife, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and disbelief. Chaska closed the boy's hand around the carved handle. "I am not leaving," he said, "but my path may lead me in different directions. This land needs guardians. It is your turn to watch. It is your turn to protect the nest." He clapped the boy on the shoulder, then turned and walked away, leaving Willie Crow standing in the fading light, the weight of the hawk knife in his hand a heavy and profound promise for the future. A gentle rain fell for a day and a night, a soft, cleansing benediction upon the wounded land. It washed the soot from the air and settled the dust, and when the sun finally returned, it shone upon a world that felt newborn. The smell of wet earth and new life began to push back against the lingering scent of smoke. A few days later, Abigail and Chaska rode out to the Blue Notch Spring. The journey itself was a testament to the change that had swept through the territory. They passed a work crew of miners and ranchers digging the main irrigation ditch, their shovels rising and falling in a shared rhythm, their friendly shouts echoing in the clear air. The ugly fence Boone had erected was gone. The coiled wire hauled away for salvage. The raw timber posts left standing like lonely sentinels, their purpose erased. The water of the spring ran clear and cold, gurgling over the rocks, oblivious to the conflict that had raged over it. Abigail dismounted and walked to the edge of the water. She dipped her hands in, the cold a welcome shock, and splashed her face. It felt like a baptism. She looked at her reflection, a woman she was only just beginning to recognize. The fear was still a part of her, a faint shadow in her eyes. But it no longer owned her. It was simply a part of her story. She took the blue scarf from her hair. It was faded from the sun and frayed at the edges, a humble piece of cloth that had followed her through her entire ordeal. She walked over to the nearest fence post, a monument to a defeated tyranny, and carefully tied the scarf around it. The scrap of blue cotton fluttered in the breeze, a small, bright flag of defiance that had become a symbol of a freedom now enshrined in the community's shared will. It was no longer just her freedom. It belonged to all of them. Chaska came to stand beside her, his eyes following the movement of the scarf. He had watched her tie the knot, his expression thoughtful and serene. He did not speak for a long time, the only sounds the whisper of the wind and the music of the spring. "I cannot promise you a peaceful life, Abigail," he said at last, his voice quiet and deep. "A perfect match for the landscape. This land does not offer it. It is a place of fire and flood, of sudden storms and long, hard winters. There will always be another struggle." He turned to face her, his dark eyes holding hers. His hands, warm and calloused, came up to gently hold her own. "But I can promise that you will not face it alone. I can promise to walk beside you, to stand with you at the firebreak, and to pull you from the floodwaters, to share the silence of the winter nights and the work of the summer days. I promise to be your partner, in all of it." It was not a question, but a statement of fact, a declaration of a truth that had already been forged between them. It was the most honest and beautiful proposal she could ever have imagined. Tears welled in her eyes, but they were not tears of sadness or fear. They were tears of profound, overwhelming joy. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, we will live out loud, together." Their wedding was not held in a church. It was held in a meadow, halfway between the town and the Lakota camp, on a patch of ground that belonged to everyone and no one. There was no preacher in a black coat, but two moons, who spoke of the circle of life, of two paths becoming one, his words a blessing that felt as old as the hills themselves. The whole community was there. It was a gathering that, only weeks before, would have been impossible. Miguel Delgado sat on a log, his fingers dancing over the strings of an old guitar, playing a melody that was full of the sun and soul of Mexico. Beside him, a Lakota elder tapped a slow, steady heartbeat on a handheld drum, and a woman's voice rose in a haunting, wordless song that spoke of the vastness of the prairie sky. The two distinct melodies did not clash. They wove together, creating a new kind of music, a sound that was uniquely their own. Tanta May had outdone herself, presiding over a long table laden with food. There were platters of her famous stew, baskets of fresh bread, and a mountain of hot, sweet beignets dusted with powdered sugar. Rosa Delgado had brought pots of spicy beans and stacks of warm tortillas. There was roasted corn and wild berries and fresh, cool water drawn from the new community ditch. Edie Quinn was there, not with her reporter's notebook, but with a large, clumsy camera mounted on a wooden tripod. She bustled about, her face hidden periodically under a black cloth, capturing the images of this new world being born in the blacksmith laughing with a Lakota elder. Rosa and Tanta May exchanging recipes. The children, a wild, happy mix of all races and backgrounds, chasing each other through the tall grass, their shrieks of laughter the purest music of all. Abigail did not wear a white dress. She wore a simple blue cotton dress, the color of the prairie sky after a storm, and in her hair was a single wild rose that Chaska had picked for her that morning. He stood beside her, not in a suit, but in his comfortable buckskins, a gift of a beautifully beaded belt from his people, his only adornment. They exchanged no rings. Instead, he gave her a small, smooth stone from the Blue Notch Spring, and she gave him a newly braided leather cord for his hair. Their vows were the simple promises he had made to her by the water, spoken again before their chosen family. Life settled, not into peace, but into purpose. The first structure completed with communal labor was not a new saloon or a bigger jail, but a small, sturdy, one-room schoolhouse. Abigail was its teacher. Every morning, a dozen children would file in, their faces scrubbed clean, their minds hungry. The Lakota boy she had first helped at the water trough sat in the front row, his brow furrowed in concentration as he painstakingly formed the letters of his name. The Delgado children sat beside the blacksmith's son, and Willie Crow, though nearly a man, came in the afternoons to improve his reading, the hawk knife a quiet presence at his belt. While Abigail taught the language of books, Chaska taught the language of the land. He took the older children, both boys and girls, out into the hills. He showed them how to read the clouds, how to find their way by the stars, how to know which plants were medicine and which were poison. He taught them to ride not with force, but with understanding, to become a part of the horse, to move as one. He was not just teaching survival, he was teaching respect. Their own small cabin, built by a dozen pairs of hands on the piece of land that had once been her father's, became a new kind of center for the community. It was a place where people came with their problems, to seek advice from Chaska's calm wisdom or to find comfort in Abigail's steady strength. It was a house built not on a fraudulent debt, but on a foundation of shared struggle and mutual aid. One evening, as the sun was setting, casting long golden rays across the prairie, Abigail and Chaska stood on the small porch of their home. They looked out at the land, at the vast expanse that had once been a place of terror and was now a place of promise. The fields that the great fire had blackened were no longer dead and gray. A miracle was happening. A fine, green fuzz, the tender shoots of new grass, was pushing up through the ashes, a vibrant testament to the land's resilience. As they watched, a herd of wild horses appeared on the horizon. They ran with a fluid, joyful power, their manes and tails streaming in the wind. They were the untamed spirit of the land, beautiful and free. They swept across the burned field, their hooves stirring the ashes, their passage a living promise of renewal. They were a part of the great circle, a world washed clean by fire, now teeming with the fierce, stubborn, and beautiful tenacity of new life. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment where you are listening from so we can all connect, and be sure to subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales. Like this video, and press the hype button to help more people hear this story.